Welcome to today's session on the role of the chair. For those of you I haven't met previously, I'm Oliver Cummings, CEO of NewRole. We started NewRole because we believe boards matter and traditional search processes were not up to the task or evolving. Thanks to your support and our unique Headhunter plus technology hiring service is now the market leader, placing around 1,000 non-executives and chairs on boards every year, but we're only just getting started. What's clear to us is that finding the best board members is not enough. They also need ongoing opportunities to learn, improve, and become or stay best in class. And that's why we launched the NewRole Board Community, a non-executive community space offering access to private peer discussions on board issues, networking opportunities, portfolio building advice, and expert panels like this one today. So I'm delighted to welcome you for today's panel discussion on the role of the chair, which epitomizes the spirit of the NewRole Board Community, and a huge thanks to our three panelists for taking the time to share their experience. I'm not going to do introductions in the interest of time. Ruth, Peter, and Vindy's bios were all circulated in the pre-read. But I would like to encourage audience interaction using the chat to stimulate discussion. I'd encourage you to use these three hashtags, hashtag AHA, followed by any insight you have. If we're not seeing enough of those, the panel will know they need to up their game. Hashtag question. So any question you have for your fellow audience members, not the panel, please use the Q&A function for that. And hashtag debate for anything you disagree on and want to spark a discussion around. This discussion will be in 4 parts with a wrap up at the end. We'll start with an overview of the role of the chair, talk about some of the lessons the panel have learned from mistakes they've made, and then move on to lessons they've learned from things that have gone well. We'll then open it up for a Q&A where we will tackle the top upvoted questions from you, the audience. So do ask questions using the Q&A and do upvote those questions that you would most like to hear the panel respond to. So without further ado, let's start talking about the role of the chair. And I'd like, Ruth, if I could come to you first, just to get your sense of what are the parts of being a chair that you most enjoy?
Okay, so I'm thinking about this, Oliver. I went back to, so why do I want to do this role anyway? And I think it's very much to have the opportunity to do something that's important, to add value, to make a difference. And so the things that I enjoy most are when I really feel that that's being achieved, and the board is working well. And I guess that naturally takes you to when the board is either in a very challenging situation or when it's facing a tricky question, and where you really need to see the board performing well in order to debate well, get to the right answer. And if you've been the chair of a board for a while, you're probably looking around the board table at people maybe you've selected, or certainly people that you think should be there. So it's very much your team. You know about the issue, you've decided the issue needs to be debated, you set up the conversation, and then I just find it very, very rewarding when you can really get a very, very meaningful conversation, good debate, good challenge, and get to a really good answer. And I've got lots of examples of that. But I thought I'd just say one where, and it's not a sort of hugely challenging question, but it's quite tricky. We had a business opportunity with a country where that country's culture, human rights would raise questions about the consistency with our principles that we've set as a company. And this was entirely legal. It was supported by our government, but even so, we've set our company principles. So how do we feel about that? And when we're looking at an opportunity like this, how should we bring those principles to life? And we managed to set up a really good conversation where all of the board contributed, listened to each other, and we managed to lay out for ourselves some ground rules. And I think for me, the sort of thing I enjoy most is where, in that sort of situation or in really, really difficult situations, you can see the board functioning very, very effectively.
Peter, how about you? What is it that you most enjoy being about being a chair?
Well, I never miss an opportunity to state the bleeding obvious, Oliver. And so just to state the obvious, we're told the role of a chair at a board, and I agree with it, is to agree a strategy with the chief executive and her team, assist in the execution of that strategy and hold the executive to account for the execution of that strategy. And it has to be said, it's a lot easier to agree a strategy with the CEO you've appointed than the one you've inherited. And you often find chairs anxious, really, to be able to get their own person into the role, and that sets up tensions we could discuss. But having said about that as a principle, I just asked a CEO of a very large company that I advise, what do you most need in a chair as a CEO, which is another way of reversing the question and get it from the CEO perspective. And what that chair told me, or at least the bit that was printable, that chair told me, was two things. That they want the chair to be a sounding board for them and open to conversations where not everything's defined, where things are not fully formed. So that the CEO wanted to feel able to go to the CEO and not have the answers to everything, but say, help me with this. And that's a good point, because on both sides of that relationship, sometimes people want everything cut and dried and how they feel confident. And then the second thing they said was managing the board productively, which I guess is a statement of the obvious, but as we as chairs know, that takes a lot of work. You asked me what we enjoy and don't enjoy. I love trying to make sure meetings are something that everybody looks forward to. And there are various ways of doing that, but that's what if I feel everybody is looking forward to the meeting and enjoying the meeting, however tough it is, I'm pleased about that. And what I don't enjoy, the thing chairs most don't enjoy is surprises. We do not like surprises. And we could unpack that if you want, but I think you know there are all sorts of surprises we do get and we don't like it at all. And then the second thing I don't enjoy, but is sometimes necessary, is when a leader or in different capacity, but senior executives have done probably 6-7 years, and probably the time has come for a change, and they don't see it. And it's always a very tough job for a chair to help them see it and move on. So that would be my pennyworth, Oliver. Thank you.
Peter, can I jump in and add something to that? So your comment about no surprises. So I found it very, very helpful, when you're starting a relationship with the CEO, to just have a very frank conversation about what are we going to expect of each other? How are we going to work together? What's going to work for you? What's going to work for me? And I absolutely put the first thing for me is no surprises. And, so far I haven't had too many. So I think I think it's really good to be explicit about expectations.
Very good.
It reminds me of, I've just finished reading Sir Nigel Rudd's book, The Chairman's Tale, where he has his 3 rules, one of which is bad news. I want to know about bad news instantly, and good news can wait, which echoes what you've both said there. Bindi, can I come to you next?
Sure. So look, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say that in my experience, good news takes the elevator and bad news takes the stairs. So, but look, what do I enjoy on a board? I think I've been on boards now for 20 plus years, 22, 23 years. And I had the opportunity to chair my first company at that point in time. It's a hugely rewarding experience for the most part. Sometimes it isn't, but for the most part it is. What are the bits? I think they've already been touched upon, but I can reinforce them. I think I particularly enjoy working with the board and the management to ensure that the strategy of the business is totally contemporary and relevant. There are too many boards which have either an outdated strategy, or actually they have a strategy model where one group produces the strategy and the other group sort of accepts it. And I think there's a real benefit to co-creating it. There's greater ownership, but you also get a better strategy. And then the second part to that is, I don't think you can do these things annually and let them be. In today's world, there's such a high velocity of change that you need to almost constantly do what Peter was saying, which is you need the strategy, then you need to hold people accountable, watch the execution, touch it up a little bit, twist it around. So I think it's a living thing. And that is very, very exciting, I believe. because it takes you into everything. I think the second really, for me, very satisfying thought is to make sure that I get the best from every member of the board. You know, typically you have in every board, you have groups of people. You have some people who actually are the first off the block on anything. Yeah. And then you have other people who just keep their peace. But you know, they're really good people. They've got the experience. They've been thinking about issues. So how do you actually bring out everyone to contribute on a topic? And how do you make the discussion actually go up? And I think that for me is a really satisfying part. And I know when I've done it well, and I know sometimes you come out of a meeting feeling slightly deflated because for whatever reason, it didn't do that. So that's very enjoyable. And then the third thing is what Baz said earlier, which is, I think I've been a CEO. It's a heck of a lonely job. You know, the buck stops with you. Everyone is competing for your job who works for you. So, you know, what do you think they're going to tell you? They're going to tell you everything, the truth. They're going to give you what you want to hear. It's really lonely. And you enter a meeting, you sit at the head of the table, and it's a complicated issue. At the end of it, they say, well, okay, so what do you, they all look at you. You got to give a decision. This is hard. So you need someone whom you can trust, whom you can talk to about the tough things, the difficult things. And I think that relationship of trust is really important. And so one of the things I've always done is as a chair, I always have a weekly call with my CEO. It's unscripted. There's no agenda. There are no pieces of paper. It's just, hey, what's on your mind? What's on my mind? And by the way, if we don't need the call, let's just cancel it. But I think that ability to be a thought partner for the CEO, I think, is what I particularly enjoy.
Oliver, just reacting to Joanna Young in the chat, who said that's why you need a good SID. I'm not sure which particular point she was reacting to, but it would be interesting to just pause on that, because yes, but really the chair's got to make it work. And in a way, the SID is there as first reserve, there if things go wrong, if there's a crisis, if people aren't getting on. So actually, you need a good SID, but if things are going well, that SID shouldn't have to do very much.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. So I am a SID. I think the SID role is, you know, very much easier if you have a good chair, then they will be really working on the dynamics and building the trust.
There's another comment that says, what is a SID? If they think we're talking about selling BT shares in 1988. If you see SID, tell him. Senior Independent Director, it's an acronym for which I apologize. Yeah. Sorry, Ruth, to interrupt.
No, absolutely right. Thank you. I would not like to get those confused.
Who's SID?
Yeah.
Oliver, can we have a go at can we have a go at because Peter also said what he didn't like.
Yes, go.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, and this is, you talked about the blindingly obvious, Peter. I mean, this is a bit as well, so it's so much talked about. But I think the bit I enjoy least is the bits where you're spending time on governance, which are the bits of governance that I don't think are value adding. And that's an important specification. And I do think I hear an awful lot about, you know, complaining that boards have to spend so much time on governance. And there is a lot, but also the chair does set the agenda. And I think you can set the agenda to do the governance requirements as effectively and quickly as possible and make sure you've got time for strategy, performance, people, and so on. But, you know, governance, I think a lot of governance and a lot of the more recent things in governance and some of the practices that have evolved, which are not necessarily set in the code, are actually very value adding. And I think that they're good and we should embrace them. So, you know, just for example, I think spending time reviewing what's coming out of speak up lines is really valuable because it gives you such an insight into what's going on in the organization, what sort of issues are coming through, tells you something about the culture of the organization and how the management are responding. So I think that's all very good. But reviewing endless disclosures about remuneration that, I don't think actually communicate very much, and certainly not to the investors for whom the report should be meant. I don't think that's valuable or enjoyable personally.
So I tend to agree with that. I think if I give my perspective on that, Ruth, actually, both of you have hit exactly the same 2 points that I would have. If I start with governance, I sit on public and private company boards. And actually, there's a big difference. Now, I understand the reason for the difference. In a private company board, if you're the chair or you're usually the shareholder, you represent one or two shareholders. So you're in the room. And therefore, in the public companies, you're representing shareholders who are far away, they're not in the room. There has to be a higher level of governance. But I do believe that in general, all the boards I've sat on are spend far more time on governance than they need to. And when I compare the two, I think a lot of private equity companies or private capital companies have got a better balance between thinking about strategy, execution, performance, competitiveness, technology, and actually appropriate governance. So I'm not wishing away governance. I'm just talking about the balance of time on which you occupy these boards. Governance is often also in detail. It's often better done in committees and in somewhere else. And you can then reassure the board and you can actually use the collective energy of the board differently. I think the second point, which is really hard, Peter's already hit on it. It's actually asking people to move on is never easy. It's always difficult to do. It's the hardest thing in the job, because your job, and I'll link this with what I was saying earlier, your job as the chair, I said earlier, is to build a moment of great trust, a relationship of great trust, so then that person is willing to allow you to go anywhere in the company, talk to anybody without fear or favor, share his or her inner thoughts with you, inner worries, what is he or she worried about. But you have the actual responsibility to also change that person. If the person's not relevant for the strategy or the moment of hand, or the person's not performing. This is a very delicate balance.
Bindi, can I ask you about that? And I'm curious to hear the other panelists' views on this, because at one end of the spectrum, that's interestingly the second golden rule of Nigel Rudd's chair book is I'll back you till I sack you.
Yeah.
And this incredible flip. But I've heard other guests on Enter the Boardroom and in panels saying that sacking conversation should never come as a surprise. So it feels to me like there are people take different approaches to that. Those who are kind of very transparent and the CEO knows it's coming. And then those at the other end of the spectrum where it's I'm right behind you until the second I'm not. How have the three of you handled that?
Well, I can tell you that in my case, since I continue with that, I think that it's actually unfair not to provide feedback to a CEO. That's part of your job. Somebody was earlier saying on the chat that, is the chair a coach? And of course you're a coach. That's very important. You are a coach. He's the captain of the team and you're the coach for him and the team. So integral to that is providing feedback. And in my case, I don't actually wait for some cardinal day like 1 year, one day in the year when there's some annual sort of chat and you sit down and talk to each other about appraisal. Of course you do that when you look at the objectives or the performance, but I provide feedback generally all the time. And I expect feedback all the time, because this is a relationship where you benefit from that feedback. Now, in that process, I'm sure people realize whether things are working out or not. And actually, if they don't, then they've got to be pretty thick-skinned and not good listeners, which tells you about them anyway. So at least I would be in the camp of providing feedback, but then being quite decisive about change where warranted.
Yeah. And I would be very much in the same camp as that, Bindi. So I think there's a difference between, in the private conversations with CEO, always giving feedback. I mean, that is absolutely how the relationship needs to work. But in the sort of externally, and you are there in the position of supporting until you're not. So I don't think I think you can be very clearly backing the CEO until you're not, but meanwhile giving all the feedback and actually what you're doing is seeking ways to turn things around and improve them until you're not.
I was just going to say there's a certain sort of CEO probably for whom the conversation of it is time to bid farewell would always come as a surprise, because they can be a bit tin-eared and don't spot the signs. Indeed, I've dealt with one CEO who was actually talking about stepping down and went on and on talking about stepping down over a period of about 2 years. And when I finally said, well, now you are stepping down, it came as a terrible shock.
Very interesting. I want to move on to the topic of kind of mistakes that you've made, and what have been the most important judgment calls you've got wrong as a chair, and what did you learn? Ruth, can I come to you first on that?
So I thought I'd mention two things. One is, it's more just an observation of something that I think I could have done better rather than a mistake. But when I joined the company where I'm chairing now, I mean, I joined, it was known there was a problem. There was lots of noise amongst shareholders. So it was clear that change needed to happen. And because I think of myself as being very open, low ego, never misuse things that people tell me, encourage people to share. I worked for a while on the assumption that the existing board members, when I came in, would want to really tell me what they'd experienced and what they knew and be very, very open and reveal all, so that, I could quickly form my own views. And actually what I found was that as I got more into it and started to, formulate ideas and test them with the board members, they started to open up much more. So there was clearly quite a sort of barrier and inhibition about sharing, until maybe I'd become more vulnerable by showing that I'd got, I was expressing my views. They really started to open up more. So there was, for a while, a lot of information that would have been of great use to me. But the sort of trust that was needed and the safety for them to open up in what was a sort of stressful and very pressured situation, it took more than I had realized to create that. So, that was a good reflection for me. And the other one I wanted to talk about, which I think is a real challenge, is, when you're thinking about people to join the board, on the one hand, I genuinely want diversity. And by diversity, I mean all kinds of diversity, but in particular, a whole range of different styles, and people who are going to tackle things differently. And as well as people who are extremely sort of collaborative and collegiate, I think it's very helpful to have people who are quite pointy and, who are going to be challenging, hopefully in a sort of suitable way, but people who are really going to ask the difficult questions and get them out there. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, you do absolutely need to create the team, to create the trust, to create the ways of working so that you can all work together. And, how to get the balance when you're looking at candidates between somebody who you think would really help to get to grips with issues, but would they be able to work within the team, or would they be too challenging for the management, basically? And I mean, it's sort of safe to err on one side. It's risky to go on the other side. I'm drawn to the other side, where you get more kind of diversity of style, because I think it can be very valuable. But, it doesn't always work. And I will put my hand up and say it doesn't always work, and not go into details for obvious reasons. But if you are in that position, I think, and you try to get the dynamic right. And I then think the critical thing is that you have to be prepared to bite the bullet and, sort out what you've done, have the conversations and move on. And I think just by observation of the two things I've said there, I think the chair's role is so much a people role. It's about managing the people and the dynamics of a group of people, social work and all of that.
Peter.
I just want to touch on being a chair for the first time, which will happen to everyone if they become a chair, because it'll be a first time they're the chair. And I wouldn't put it quite as strongly as imposter syndrome, but I don't think I felt that confident. And it was an incumbent CEO. And I think I got the balance of the relationship completely wrong, and I didn't assert myself enough. And I don't think I was confident enough. So I think everybody should bear in mind the first time you're chair, it's probably quite tough, and you have to think about it quite carefully. Even though you may have chaired other things in other circumstances, in roles and voluntary organizations or lower down the company, you've chaired the stuff and so on. That would be the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think immediately I understood exactly how important it was to have a really clear-eyed view on the competencies you want around the table, and how those competencies, when defined, some of which are about specific experience, but some of which are about what sort of personality or types there are as well. Almost like playing chess on a piece of paper, you make sure you get the people you need, the ideal team around the table. And I do think you need to be quite forensic about it. And I don't think I did that to start with. And maybe I'm over forensic about it, but I now have a very, very clear view about the competencies and experiences I want in each person, because I think they match the strategic needs of the company. And the third thing, I guess, is a sort of statement of the obvious, but we're living in the digital century, and we're only 20 years into the most dramatic industrial revolution we've ever experienced. Probably 50% of the job descriptions we'll be using in a decade haven't yet been invented. How agile can a company be? Always more agile and always moving, changing faster. And it doesn't matter how many times you say this or how many times you look at the sheer pace at which our lives and our businesses are changing. There's a thing in the back of all our brains that says, once we've made this change, we're on the sunny uplands and that's it, and we're fine now. And it ain't like that. And I know I may be saying that I'm, stating something we all know, but it's quite profound, how fast we have to change and respond.
Peter, can I ask you, when you talked about wanting different personalities, when you're looking for board members, how do you assess that?
Well, partly by talking to the people, but partly by getting good references, which I try to take myself quite often. And I'm looking for how these people collaborate. Are they listeners? But are they quite upfront sometimes? All those different combinations, are they team players? And you can find out quite a lot about people like that if you ask the right questions from the referees, more actually than you can from talking to somebody face to face, although that is part of the process. And sometimes, Ruth, I get it wrong.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you're recruiting for executive teams, people get all kinds of analysis done. And I've talked to very few chairs who are going down that route.
Well, there is one search firm, not yours, Oliver. So I won't name it. It would be quite terrible to trample on your hospitality in such a way. But there is a search firm at the moment that's purporting to be using AI and you're all using various nostrums, technical nostrums in the way you search for people, but using AI and using AI in the sort of way they analyze, say, CEO candidates, but then saying we're going to apply exactly the same lens to the chair and or the members of the board and see how we think the fit of personality is. Now, that may be slightly fanciful at this stage, but they say they're doing it and having some success in it. So all these methods are going to develop quite quickly. Oliver's about to tell us about his super duper technology. He's not going to be outdone, are you, Oliver?
No, I mean, I'm not going to bore you with our AI, but we are experimenting with a few things around, more structured assessment. I remember coming to this role and realizing I was terrible at hiring, and then I was relieved to discover that it turns out everyone is terrible at hiring, whether they know it or not. but there are some things that you can do to improve the odds. And we're doing a research project at the moment with an academic at one of the leading universities, and looking at values and how different values that people hold play out in the boardroom. But what's so interesting about it, and actually it feeds very nicely into the Enter the Boardroom podcast I did with Professor Alex Edmonds, around it's so difficult to prove any of this stuff because you can't do a risk control test, with sort of different variables where you control for it. So I'd be amazed if they could actually prove that those things were leading to better results, because you can't control for that single variable. That would be where my skepticism would come from. But I love the idea. Vindy, can I come to you on your sort of judgments that you've got wrong?
So look, I mean, first of all, I've got lots wrong. And I think that's important to say that because, these jobs are hard. They're all about judgment. And I think it's about getting more right than wrong, which is really helpful. So I say that to everybody just to reassure them that actually it doesn't matter if you get a few wrong, as long as you learn from them and you move on and you do it better next time. That is the important thing. But I could pick up, therefore, many examples, but let me pick up the thread that's been talked about around people and judgment on people. I recall one choice of a CEO that I made in a company that was in a very difficult situation. I won't go to the detail of it, but it was the market had changed instantly. The competitive construct had changed. One big customer had put the squeeze on the company, and what was a very, high-performing company suddenly became extraordinarily troubled. And I looked for someone to find as a successor to the current CEO who decided to lead the pitch at that point in time, just as I arrived as the chair. And we went through the normal search process, and we found somebody at the end who was very good, we thought. And actually, it turned out to be exactly the wrong person. Now, it was just wrong. He was unable to adjust from his current situation into this very difficult situation. He came from a larger company where he was a very big divisional head. This was a smaller company where he was the CEO. So there were two things different. There was a difference of context, of scale and size, a difference of resource. And this job called upon his personal leadership resilience much more than I think his previous job did. Now, we could have judged all of this, and we did a lot of things, that are being described on the call, but I still got it wrong. And the problem with it is that when you get a call like this wrong, you can't change it very easily, because actually you don't know whether you've got it wrong or not. The person comes in, 3 months go by, 6 months go by, and you're sort of thinking it's been a wrong call. But do you pull the plug? Is it the circumstances? Do you give a bit more time? Eventually, we did actually change. And it was, in my judgment, a really quick call, because we changed after about 9 months. And that's, pretty hard to do. Normally, calls like this would take 12, 18, 24 months, and therefore you have that period lost altogether. So what could we have done better? We spent a lot of time thinking about it. And in the end, actually, there's no rocket science solution. I don't think board assessments and, these tools are going to help that much. I think the two things that we could have done better is to get more people to meet the person. I find no substitute for that. And that's why I find these panel selection interviews such a poor process, because you have 4 very experienced people meeting one person for 1 hour, and you're supposed to judge that person based on the same questions that everyone's asked. So in theory, this is about fairness, but actually, who are you being fair to? You're not being fair to the company. So I really think I'd rather have...
Vindy, can I just say, very rudely interrupt, but another thing that intrigues me about the interview process is that it's extremely easy to get yourself into a position where you're really relying on the interview for, let's say, 70, 80% of your judgment. That means you are judging somebody on whether they perform well in one particular hour you're almost judging whether they're good at interviews rather than running a company.
So you're
It's got to be
spot
more
on,
than that,
Peter.
hasn't it?
You're spot on. And
Sorry
that's
to
why
interrupt.
I really believe that the more people who meet a person, and don't script the interviews, don't script those conversations, let people meet that person. Some can meet them in their office for a coffee. Some might want to have dinner. Some might want to have breakfast. But I think it's when you see people in unprepared situations, you get a much better perspective of who they are. And so I think that's the lesson I took out from that occasion, and I've tried to follow that. And I think that's extremely helpful. Followed up by exactly what Baz said, which is, and I'm sorry to say this to you, Oliver, on your pitch, I actually, of course, receive headhunter references, but I take them for what they are, but do my own referencing. And it's not
Fully
that
agree.
difficult. If you think about it, you look through a person's career and you can find and reach people very quickly and ask them personally the difficult questions. And I tell you what, I've learned more from those references than any other paper references you get. So I think it's this just increasing your diligence through the selection process, and referencing was the lesson that I took out.
Really interesting. There's a really nice piece of research that was done in the 90s by a pair called Schmidt and Hunter, who looked at sort of correlation between outcomes and assessment processes. And they showed there were three things people did that had any impact. One was GMAs, general mental ability tests. The other was job-specific tests. And the third was structured interviews. And the job-specific test, one of the things I see in boards using the platform, which I really like, is where they put people, they do a walk around with a bunch of the candidates, and they see how the candidates interact with each other and also with other board members. Because what they're looking for is not just how does that individual contribute, but how does that individual enhance the collective group, which I think is really nice.
Yeah.
Lindy, I did think that your story, I mean, it's a sort of age-old mantra, and very often true, that most decisions to move on and take action to change somebody out, in hindsight, people always think they did it too slowly. They should have made the decision
Absolutely
earlier. But I would imagine that in your situation, if it was it a public company?
No.
Okay, because I was going to say, if you've appointed the CEO of a public company, then you can make your own decision about whether you need to move on, and you've done it wrong very quickly. But my goodness, you've got to think about preserving value and confidence in the company and how to navigate your way through that.
So I agree with you, Ruth, and I've struggled with this a lot. But I tell you, having now spent length of time in both sorts of companies, I've concluded that, in public companies, things can move much faster. There is much higher inertia, and there's always something to worry about. It's the shareholders, or it's the analysts, or it's the media, or something. And I actually feel that in many ways that stalls action, and that often people get overtly cowed by that. And you've got to make a personal resolve to get past that. And it's harder, much harder. And the second thing you have to do is you have to work harder to get alignment, because actually everyone else on the board is worried about exactly those issues. So you'll always have, and you're never quite sure whether people are responding to the issue at hand, or whether they're talking because they're worried about the effect of the decision. So actually it is harder to take in public markets, but my view is, we've still got to do it.
Yeah.
And it's up to people like us. And the key to it is actually, if you are in the end prepared to say, look, I stand by this decision to change, even if it takes away my role, then that's fine. I think you've got to get to that level of decision making, in my view.
And if I could just add something on your point around, boards, almost getting themselves frozen by looking at all these obstacles and risks. I just want to come back to something else I was going to say about governance, which is a bit of a pet theme at the moment. But I do think that whilst there's a lot of debate about corporate governance at the moment, and whilst I think there's quite a push to simplify it, and with the FRC being more open to looking at that as well. But I do think that we've put an awful lot of straitjackets on ourselves.
Yeah.
Because an awful lot of things that are not required, there's guidance and there's best practice, and so many organizations and people in organizations talk about those as if we have to be compliant.
I think it's a great example.
Really, strip things away and think what's right for the company.
It's a great example. Actually, the code of conduct in the UK is actually focused on comply and explain or explain. And actually, that's been taken to mean comply. And we don't actually question that enough. And I think that's really important. We have to get back to the spirit of the code, which is, comply is a guideline, but there could be very good reasons why you might wish to do something else. You just have to have the courage of conviction to explain.
Oliver, I was just interested in Sandra's question on the chat, which said, and this may be a little premature, is it? You're not ready.
No, I am actually ready to go to the questions. I was exactly going to say it's a good thing. I want to go to the most upvoted ones though first, if that's all right.
I'll try and behave myself. Sandra, it was a very good question, but you may never get an answer.
Put it in the Q&A and hope that others upvote it. The first one up there comes from Anthony James Clare, which is asking for any practical tips on how to make meetings enjoyable. And I think this is picking up on a point, Peter, you made.
Yeah, well, I'm going to now be completely unhelpful and put this together with Sandra's question, because she said, how do you make a dysfunctional board functional? And it's actually part of it. The answer is making meetings enjoyable. But I'll talk about a board, obviously no names, no pack drill, a board that I became chair of at one point. And I went along to a board meeting before I became chair to get the atmosphere, see what's going on. And I couldn't believe the extraordinary dysfunctionality, the hostility between the chair and the CEO, the fact that every time the CEO was talking, the chair was looking down and shaking their head disapprovingly. And it was just appalling, actually. It was the most dysfunctional thing I've ever seen. And it took me about 18 months after I became the chair, with a combination of showing respect, doesn't mean being uncritical, making the meetings more enjoyable. There's a time for humor as well as a time for, dead straight stuff. Having the board actually to my house, for Christmas dinner. I mean, the list goes on, but, you really do have to think about this very hard. And that's the way you make things enjoyable, that you have good play as well as good work.
Ruth, you raised an eyebrow there at that, inviting the board round to your dinner. Sounds like you won't be doing that.
Well, I haven't done that yet, but I'm always learning. So, yes, I think that it's I think that building opportunities for the board to get to know each other. So it's about building trust within the team. And I do think that having dinners together, but also, I mean, board visits are a great time for lots and lots and lots of one-on-one and smaller group conversations and people just getting to know each other. But I do think that, there's also, Peter, you said in your opening about the importance of your opening comments about the importance of, running a board effectively. I mean, one of the most unenjoyable things about being a board member in a meeting is when it just doesn't keep to time, and it's always you think you're nearly at the end, and then suddenly everyone adds, and you go on for another hour or whatever.
I used to sit on a board where the chair was a perfectly decent person, but had very little natural empathy. And so this particular chair would spend most of the time poring over the notes and looking down the whole time, sort of thinking, what's the next item and what do I need to say about that? And never thinking, what the hell's going on around me? It's like a theatrical performance, a board meeting, and you're the director, and you've got to bloody well know what the actors are doing.
Yeah.
And indeed, you've got to be ready to applause and boo sometimes. But to have your head down the whole time, my God, that was a disaster. Those meetings were awful.
I suppose, board meetings are about hardware and software. And I think we're talking about both. And actually, you got to get the hardware really right, which is you got to make sure that your agenda is really focused. People only need to talk about a few things on the board. That's a really important thing in life. You go to too many boards where the agenda is so long, and that leads to time issues and so on. So you got to decide what is it that this board should really spend their energy on, and then allow time for it. But importantly, ensure that there's enough input from the management on that topic, and it's very brief. It's not like 500 pages unless you're a bank, and there are regulatory reasons why you got to have it. So you got to insist on crisp data, and again, insist that you're not going to spend all your time looking at PowerPoints. So there's a kind of a hardware aspect to running board meetings, which is really important, and you need the cooperation of usually the CEO, but a really good company secretary to help you chart that out. And then there's the soft side of things, which is how do you make sure that people are free and to speak and really say their mind. And I must say that it is all about relationships in the end. So it's about board members getting to know each other, whether you do it by spending a day out together or go to Christmas lunch. By the way, Peter, you've never invited me to Christmas lunch.
You've never invited me onto one of your boards.
So, whether it's that or, for instance, one of the things I do is I always hold a board dinner before the board meeting. And actually, that's quite useful because it's a good time. Everyone's primed for the key issue, and you can start the discussion over dinner. And usually you find after a couple of glasses of wine, people are far more able to tell you exactly what they think about that. And it kind of breaks the ice for the difficult conversation the next day. And you don't need to have the board meeting, but I think if you toss the issues out, it helps. So hardware and software.
Love that. Thank you, Vinny. And Peter, you demonstrated you still got the eye for the popular question, not just Big Brother, but Sandra's question there raced to the top of the list. So I'm glad we answered that. The next most popular question comes from Damien Mummian, which is, what warning signs should a chair look out for on their own performance? And when do you know to move on yourself? Who wants to take that?
Well, I suppose the obvious point, Oliver, is that there are rules about it. And, on a public board, you can't serve more than 9 years. By the way, I think some of those rules are not absolutely the right thing, but that's probably a discussion for another time. I do agree that on the whole, most of us don't know when to move on, either from CEO jobs or chair jobs, because we regard ourselves as essential. I'm not being satirical. I mean, if you've got a certain amount of self-respect, you've got to sort of think what you're doing is right or important, or not without being self-critical. So it is difficult to know when to move on, but I tend to move on from things quite quickly, so I'm not found out, Oliver. That's my principle.
I think this reminds me of a story. Someone once told me that it's really good to leave a party at 5 to midnight when your host is actually entreating you to stay. And if you stay till 5 past midnight, it's only 10 minutes more. But actually, as soon as the door's shut, the person's saying, gee, I mean, what was this guy all about? So I think that's an interesting rule. And certainly one I followed, which is to try and leave while you're still contributing. And if you're contributing, people actually want you around. And look, I mean, that. You get a feel for that. That, about yourself. So I think that's an important rule. And by the way, to the discussion earlier, in case you don't realize that, and you're pretty thick-skinned, that is when the SID begins to earn his or her money. That's the job of the SID, to actually plan the chair's succession and to make sure that that it is well trained. So, getting the period right. When does the chair leave? When does the CEO leave? When does the SID leave? This is just good board practice. And when it works well, it's really good.
Ruth, you were going
I'd well, nothing very different except one thing to add. And it's not really about timing. But I do think the relationship between the chair and the CEO is just so important. Especially, you're going to have a great relationship. You're the chair, you're going to think that the CEO is doing a really good job. We talked earlier about you back the CEO until you don't. So, you're really there, but you mustn't become their chief cheerleader. You have to remain very objective. You need to keep enough, I think you need to keep enough distance. And therefore that is something I'm always, in the fortunate position of having what I think is a very good CEO, you're always just checking myself that, there's enough sort of checks and balances that I and the board are not getting overly, to be fans. And I have seen boards and I've known of boards where that has become an issue, and then that objectivity gets less. And I think for me, the most important signal to me that the time was coming up would be, I'm massively curious. If I'm not feeling curious and excited to find out more anymore, then I've probably done enough.
There's another question there from Chris, references a recent study on board roles and responsibilities that identified only 34% of executives think their boards are asking enough probing questions. Any thoughts on why that is and how boards should be evolving to address the growing risks and complexities faced by execs today?
Well, I think it goes to what Vindy was saying earlier, about the structure of a board agenda, whether there's enough space, whether the culture is such that it is expected that people probe and explore rather than just simply rubber stamp. So there's all sorts of interesting points there, but I think Vindy's sort of half answered that one already.
I think there's an element as well that, it comes back to, the question I think you mentioned, Peter, about or asking the chairman, the CEO, what do you want from a board? And in an ideal world, and the ideal CEO really wants to get value from the board, and then they will be skillful, hopefully, at positioning what they're saying, because there is such an enormous knowledge gap that they have to, I think, they need to learn the skills to present what they're doing and to seek feedback in a way that makes it accessible, so that the really tough probing questions can be asked. They can easily just sort of, give a marvelous spiel about everything and, leave the Neds sort of left with rather silly questions to ask. So I think that the CEO needs to trust the board that they almost behave in a way that seeks and enables the good conversation to take place.
Maybe one thing I would add to that is that I think from the chair's perspective, what can you do? I think what the chairs can certainly do is to ensure that the directors have a good understanding of the company. And now that's an obvious statement, but actually, I've been on boards where, as a director, where I found that there's very unequal knowledge because people spend different amount of time in actually getting to know the company. Some people are hugely interested and they take the initiative to go well beyond either the board meeting or the structured inductions. And other people just do the bare minimum. And that's a reality of boards. And as a chair, I actually insist on trying to raise the bar, because my feeling is back to what's being asked. It's very hard to contribute if you don't really understand the business. And most of business is so complicated. And Ruth just said it. If you spend basically, you show up 6 times a year, you can't know much about that business. Your comments are likely to be superficial. So I think you've got to spend the time and the energy, and that's one of the things the chair can do. The second bit is some of this has to be unscripted access. And that goes a little bit back to what, CEO's role. You've got to make sure that the board has unscripted access to the company without becoming a nuisance, because they have to be able to talk to people and understand the business. Then they can be really helpful.
Before we move
So
to,
can I just
go
add,
on, Ruth.
because I think, I very much recognise and very much agree with your comments about, the board members need to invest the time. But even so, there's going to be such a knowledge gap between the CEO who spends probably, 16 hours a day
For sure.
with the company. And so I do think it's very much about the kind of conversation that you have. So, if a leader of part of the business comes in and wants to give their show and tell about everything that they're doing and all about the business, it's very, I don't think it's conducive to having good debate. But if they come and say, you've had some pre-read about it all, but the 3 really big things that I'm struggling with are these, or if I'm looking at a new project, I'd like input on what are the big things I should be thinking about. You can frame the conversation that you get much more powerful debate.
In the government department that I'm on the board of, it's routine that every paper has at the end of it the 3 main questions we're asking the board are.
Yeah.
That can be, but went into the papers. Sorry, Oliver.
I'm going to jump in before I run over horribly on time. I want to there's one last question I'm going to ask you for a one sentence answer to before we go to the wrap up, and that's from Nigel Boothroyd, who's asking, who do you look to as chair for inspiration and mentorship? So maybe in one sentence from each of you quickly. Vindy, can I start with you?
Who do I look to for inspiration?
And mentorship.
Actually, I don't have any one fixed person, because I really think that, I can learn from every situation. I've learned a lot of things from this conversation, for example, from the collective discussion. So yeah, from everybody around me every time.
And from the boards I sit on, I learn from that I'm where I'm not the chair. I learn from the chair chairing it, and I learn from the good things they do and the bad things they do.
Yeah, and sorry, I do exactly the same. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you. So going to go to a wrap up now. So I'm going to ask each of you in no more than 90 seconds for your 3 key takeaways for those listening, for anyone chairing a board. Ruth, can I come to you first?
So I think my first thing for those on this call who are not chairs already, I think really, really, really important to understand, why do you want to be a chair? So to think deeply about what's your motivation, not because it's the next step on your career, not because of the ego, because it's a very different role. So I think really understanding what the motivation is, I would strongly advise. I think similarly, if you're looking to be a chair, choose a company that you're really going to care about, because chairing a company is something that really takes up a heck of a lot of your headspace. And you need to really feel very committed and involved. And then I would just say something I mentioned earlier, that a huge amount of the chair role is about interacting with people. It's about getting the best out of people. It's getting the right groups of people. So, Vindy, you talked about strategy. Lots of aspects of the role are really, really important. But I think at heart, getting the right people and the most out of them is a core of what the role is.
Peter.
Quickly, and this may sound a trivial point, but we've talked around it a lot. I like to see all the faces of all the members of people attending a board, so that I can encourage people to say things who look as though they have something to say but haven't actually said it, and bring them out, judge the feeling of the meeting. So either a round table or if it's a long table, sit at the end. I don't care if people think I'm on a power kick. So I can see everybody's faces. Absolutely critical. The last 2 points I'm just going to steal from the wonderful chat stream we've had going on during the meeting. just to remind us that we're dealing with people here, and it's the relationships between the people that makes it tick. Anthony James Clare said he started off as chair by asking all the members of the board to bring an item that told you something about them. I thought it was wonderful, Anthony. A really clever way of breaking the ice and getting people to understand what makes people tick. I love that. And lastly, and I'm enormously indebted to Ginny, who's told us what Sid really means. It isn't senior independent director. She said Sid was the man who ran the post room at Rothschild's.
Vindy.
Well, look, my three answers are it's all about people, people, and people. And therefore, that's where it begins, that's where it ends. It's about making sure you have the best folks around the table on the board. It's making sure you have the best CEO, not the perfect CEO. You'll never have the perfect CEO, but a good, solid, perfect, good CEO. And making sure that you yourself bring as much of yourself to bear, to everything you do. It's all about people.
Well, that is all we have time for today. A huge thank you to our panelists. I can see amazing feedback coming into the chat now, really appreciating the incredible experience and wisdom that you have shared. So a huge thank you to the three of you. To revisit this discussion, the recording is going to be available in the New Role Board Community Knowledge Centre, so you can find it there if you want to go back and revisit it. If you enjoyed this event and would like to know more about the community, we're running an introductory offer of 4 weeks free. We'll circulate details after this. We've got some great panels like this coming up on strategy, board effectiveness reviews, and determining when to step down from the role, as well as our regular slots for masterminds, coaching, and networking. Thank you so much for joining and being such a great audience. I've loved watching the interaction, and thank you again to the panelists. Look forward to seeing you all at another event soon. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you all.
Thank you.